economics and the science industry generally is infected with mathematical Platonism. Freedom is built on reason, which is why I am doing a series of videos on the epistemology of reason. What is mathematical Platonism? One website on philosophy describes mathematical Platonism as a metaphysical account of mathematics. That implies mathematical entities exist, that they are abstract, that they are independent of our rational activities. I would define mathematical Platonism as when you treat mathematics as metaphysics. In other words, that it tells you about or is the fundamental nature of reality. Of course, mathematical Platonism starts with Plato, and Plato's idea of the ideal world that we can't see, but we can only understand through contemplation. In this ideal world, there are these ideal forms. Not surprisingly, these ideal forms include mathematical forms like circles, squares, and triangles. Mathematical Platonism detaches math from reality, and therefore these mathematical truths, whether they be in economics or physics, are not subject to verification or disproof by empirical data, which undermines the whole science project of the Enlightenment. But why do I say that mathematical Platonism has infected economics? This issue about the role of mathematics in economics goes back at least to the 1960s, as this quote from the economist Jacob Schmookler proves. Schmookler asks, "Is mathematics appropriate in economics at all?" Yes, mathematics is appropriate when it is used correctly. Mathematics cannot be used to make a non-empirical hypothesis seem more scientific, and it is inappropriate to use mathematics to make heuristic models, at least without acknowledging it. Mathematics is only appropriate when it is the reflection of the underlying economic principles and empirical observation. It can never be the driver. What Schmookler is saying here is he completely rejects mathematical Platonism in economics. As this article from Mises.org's website shows, Austrians have generally been against or opposed to mathematics in economics. But you'll notice that their rejection of mathematics is much more broad than Schmookler's statement about when mathematics is appropriate. It suggests that there's a special form of epistemological knowledge in economics that is separate from other fields of study. While Schmookler's quote is what I would call the standard point of view of Enlightenment science. Interestingly, Milei described himself as an Austrian economist, but he also described himself as a mathematical economist. You can see that there appears to be somewhat a contradiction here. Milei has been quite critical of neoclassical economists, saying things like, their model has nothing to do with reality, nothing that makes sense in life, but a pure mathematical structure to be able to have an optimum for this, which we saw as crap. In other words, it's absurd. Milei has also pointed out economists need to think outside the box. When your model fails, you shouldn't get angry with reality, but rather with the model and change it. In another similar quote, he says the problem with neoclassical economics is that the mathematical model that they fell in love with is not mapped to reality. So they put down their mistakes to supposed market failures. So Milei has clearly been confronted with mathematical Platonism in economics and firmly rejects it. But he doesn't subscribe to the Austrians' point of view that data is irrelevant to some aspects of economics. He often points to data first as one of his philosophical points in his speeches, and he also gives mountains of data in his speeches, including about economic growth versus economic freedom and GDP per capita over a period of time of history. While Milei has not specifically talked about mathematical Platonism, he appears to have a position that's closer to Jacob Schmookler's than either the mathematical Platonists or the pure Austrian point of view. This whole antagonism of Austrians to mathematics seems to stem from Ludwig von Mises's epistemological point of view. Mises's epistemological point of view is just a rehash of Kant's epistemology, which is also just a bad rehash of Plato's epistemology. Followers of Mises love to say that there's this sort of perfect world which can be proved in economics, like Plato's perfect forms. These things can be proved independent of empirical data. This is where the whole a priori nonsense in Austrian economics comes from. However, Austrians reject the idea that these a priori truths are found in mathematics. Michael Crichton has two great examples of mathematical Platonism. They aren't in economics, but nevertheless they give you an idea of the absurdity of mathematical Platonism. Most people know Michael Crichton as the author of Jurassic Park, although he wrote a number of science fiction novels. He illustrates the absurdity of mathematical Platonism through two examples. One is the search for extraterrestrial life, and the other is the so-called nuclear winter. He talks about both these cases in a lecture he gave entitled Aliens Cause Global Warming. Michael Crichton points out that in 1960, the SITI, an organization searching for extraterrestrial life, published a scientific-looking equation called the Drake equation, which purports to tell us the chances that there is another advanced civilization on a planet in the Milky Way. The goal and the effect of the Drake equation was to give a sense of scientific legitimacy to the search for extraterrestrial life. But as Crichton points out, the problem, of course, is that none of these terms can be known, and most cannot even be estimated. The only way to work the equation is to fill in with guesses, and guesses, just so we're clear, are merely expressions of prejudice. They are not, nor can they be, informed guesses. If you need to state how many planets with life go on to communicate, there's simply no way to make an informed guess. It's simply prejudice. This is one of the most blatant cases of mathematical Platonism, which shows that it becomes detached from reality. The other case that Michael Crichton points to is the supposed nuclear winter scare, which was brought up by the infamous astronomer Carl Sagan. Sagan and his buddies created a report called the T-TAP report. The idea behind the nuclear winter is that when a nuclear war occurs, there would be so much particulate thrown up in the air that would cause a winter, would block out the sun and cause temperatures to drop drastically, creating a permanent winter. They also created an impressive-looking equation, much like the Drake equation. But as Crichton points out, none of the variables can be determined, none at all. The T-TAP study addresses the problem in part by mapping out different wartime scenarios and assigning numbers to some variables. But even so, the remaining variables were and are simply unknowable. No one knows how much smoke will be generated when cities burn, creating particles of what kind and for how long. No one knows the effect of local weather conditions on the amount of particles that will be injected into the troposphere. No one knows how long those particles will remain in the troposphere, and so on. But the mainstream media ran with this nonsense, pretending it was real, when in fact it was just politics pretending to be science. It reminds me of the COVID models and the global warming models, completely made up with no understanding of the variables that actually apply. And Crichton wasn't the only one to complain about the lack of science involved in the T-TAPS report. Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said, "I really don't think these guys know what they're talking about." Freeman Dyson said, "It's an absolutely atrocious piece of science, but who wants to be accused of being in favor of nuclear war?" While these are two prominent examples that many people can relate to, this idea of mathematical Platonism runs deep in economics and many sciences, including physics. In my opinion, the economics literature is littered with mathematical heuristic models in which none of the variables are measured or measurable, which appears to be part of Milei's complaint with neoclassical economics. Mathematical Platonism is a cancer destroying science and economics. Despite the incredible word salad mumbo-jumbo of philosophers and scientists, two of the greatest examples of epistemological errors in science can be wrapped up in this one sentence. Concepts divorced from facts are just fantasy. Facts divorced from concepts are just noise. The first part of the sentence, concepts divorced from facts are just fantasy, is what mathematical Platonism is. Math is not metaphysics. To suggest math is metaphysics is to go back into the superstition of the Dark Ages and completely undermine the Enlightenment scientific experiment from Galileo on. Math is just a language, and like any other language, it can be used to describe reality or it can be used to describe fantasy. An obvious historical example that most people are familiar with are epicycles. Scientists had the perfect mathematical description of the epicycles. That didn't make them true or reality. And every video game has different game physics. Those physics are completely logically consistent within the game, but that's not reality. Neither are the stupid COVID models that they use to push their totalitarian policies, nor are those stupid global warming climate change models, which have been wrong over and over again, which were also created to give a scientific patina to their totalitarian aims. I think Jacob Schmookler nailed it on the head as to when mathematics is important or can be used in economics. In fact, when it can be used in any science. Despite the mental masturbation of some physicists, science isn't mathematics. All of biological taxonomy has very little to do with mathematics. For instance, Milei not only encountered this mathematical Platonism in his work in economics, but he firmly rejected it, which is one of the reasons I am so impressed with Milei. He's not been suckered in by any of the nonsensical stuff that you might expect since he was a mathematical economist. He also didn't fall for the Mises Austrian idea of a priori knowledge, or that there is a different epistemological method appropriate for economics. Once again, proving the genius of Javier Milei. And as he says, long live freedom, damn it.